Hey guys, we are in chapter 4 in your book, and we are going to talk about emotional and personality development. This is the first in, I believe we're going to have 3 section videos for this chapter. So, emotional and personality development. So, emotions are feeling or affect that occurs when a person in a state or interaction that is important to him or her. So, it plays important roles in communication with others, behavioral organization. There's a range of positive and negative emotions. So there's biological and environmental influences. So facial expressions of basic emotions are the same across cultures. So you look at joy of this child and sadness, fear. So you see that, and surprise. So you see this kid's surprised. So the way your face reacts is similar across cultures. Um, Emotion linked interchange provides foundation for the infant's developing attachment to the parent. Social relationships. So they provide the setting for the development of a rich variety of emotions. Display rules are not universal though. So think of different cultures have different rules when certain emotions should be expressed, right? So they govern when, where, and how emotions should be expressed. And consider there in cultures there are differences between, like, look at our culture. There are differences between when people think men should express emotion versus women. So that's kind of the way our culture has formulated this idea that um, you've heard that men shouldn't cry. Man up. When you hear man up, um, no tears. Things like that. But females, they tend to be okay with crying, right? People tend to be okay with crying, which obviously this is an issue because we know that males and females both feel these emotions um, and should be able to express emotions, right? But that's the way our culture has kind of created, has, I guess, perpetuated this myth that men can't cry, right? Or should not cry. So, early emotions. So, emotions expressed during the first 6 months of life: surprise, interest, joy, anger, sadness, fear, disgust. Self conscious emotions develop later in infancy. That's like jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, and guilt. Um, Emotional expressions in relationships. So, infants' emotional communications permit coordinated interactions with caregivers. And this is the beginning of, emotional bonds. So crying, we talked about previously that there are different types of cries for babies to kind of communicate. And so you have the basic cry, which is a rhythmic. There's a cry, a brief silence, shorter, and inspiratory whistle that is higher pitched than the main cry, and a brief rest before the next cry. Now, as a parent, you don't think about um, the types of crying that happen at first. You're just, oh my gosh, my kid is crying. What is wrong? Um, but slowly, as a parent, you kind of, even without this education, as a parent, the more you are used to your child crying, sometimes you can still pick up on what they need. So, angry cry is a variation of the basic cry with more excess air forced through the vocal cords, and the pain cry is a sudden, long, initial loud cry followed by breath holding. So, I know when my kids cried at certain times, I could tell what it was they needed. Oh, that's his hungry cry. That's obviously his hungry cry. So, and part of that is because, okay, I knew it's about time to eat. This obviously needs to happen, or this. Um, my oldest son would cry whenever he had a dirty diaper. Some kids actually don't tell you by crying that their diaper's dirty because my youngest son did not bother him. So we had to check him much more often because our oldest son would let us know, but our youngest son would not. Okay, so the smiling, the reflexive smile versus the social smile. I have a couple of short YouTube videos to show you. This is a reflexive smile. So this baby is actually sleeping, but it's hard to tell because baby's eyes keep opening a little bit, or stay open. So that you can see the smile. There you go. And that is, as a parent, you're like, oh my God, my kid is smiling. And you're so excited as a parent. You're like, oh, look, they must be dreaming these, and it's comforting as a parent to think about that kind of thing. But that's a reflexive smile, so it's not really in response to any kind of external stimuli. But then you have the social smile.
Emilia smiles. Emilia, amore, amore, fai sorrisini. Fai sorrisini a mamma. Come on, give us a smile. Give us a smile.
So you see, this was in response to a stimulus, and that's like kind of why it's a social smile. So here it was an actual social situation, a child interacting with the caregiver. The caregiver is provoking a smile, right? So fear, so stranger anxiety, fear and weariness of strangers, separation protest, distress crying when the caregiver leaves. Social referencing is reading emotional cues in others to help determine how to act. So I know that I even social reference sometimes because I'm like, I really don't know how, like in certain social situations, I don't know how to react to this information. So you kind of get an idea of how to act based on how others are acting around you. It helps infants interpret ambiguous situations more accurately. So this should be a video about social referencing.
Typically in this situation, the baby will check with her facial expression, and then what we do is have the mom either smile, in which case the babies tend to go across or look afraid, and that affects the babies and they stay back.
The baby looks at the drop, then checks with his mother.
Oh, no, he's
the
not
baby
gonna
drops down and backs away. So even when the drop is shallow, the baby won't cross when warned off by his mother's facial expression. Now, what will happen if the mother smiles?
Once she smiled, he picked up on that and was trying to come across. He turned around and started treating this like a step, but he was definitely trying, and his behavior changed when she smiled and let him know it was okay.
So this child is like looking at his mother like, oh my gosh, what? So he sees his mother's reaction that's like, oh my gosh, surprised or fearful or whatever. And then he's like, oh no, I'm not going to do it, because he can interpret that. This child knew the difference between this negative emotion, like, fear, versus when the mother was smiling and happy, and then this child is willing to try to climb down, right? So even at this age, the child has learned at this point how to interpret these social referencing cues from the parent. So emotional regulation and coping, infants gradually develop an ability to inhibit or minimize the intensity and duration of emotional reactions. Caregivers' actions and contexts can influence emotional regulation. Soothing modulates emotions, reduces levels of stress hormones. Later, infants redirect or distract themselves to reduce arousal levels. So, you've probably heard expressions about whether or not parents should allow their babies to just cry it out. So at some point, infants will learn to soothe themselves, but at first they don't know how. So crying it out, when you bring home a new baby, letting them cry, it kind of it's actually not enhancing their this bond, and they are learning to mistrust. So they're not going to trust this caregiver because the the soothing, they're not giving the soothing when this child needs it, right? So later on, there's a difference between when the infants can soothe themselves and when they can't. But at first, to reduce these stress hormones and help the child learn this emotional regulation, that it's really difficult to know, as a parent, you're like, well, I don't want my child to cry, but I also don't want them to become dependent on this support that I want to give them, right? So that's always difficult for parents to understand. Temperament, so individual differences in their behavioral styles at first, like their emotions and their characteristics or ways they respond to things. How quickly emotion is shown, how strong it is, how long it lasts, and how quickly it fades away are different between babies. Not all babies are the same, right? Emotional reactivity and self-regulation, speed and intensity, positive and negative emotions, extent or effectiveness of an individual's control over their emotions. So all babies are individuals, and they have different ways that they respond innately. Like they have different ways they cry. Like some babies might cry more quickly than others to a certain thing, right? Like I said, one of my children did not cry whenever they were wet, where the other one would. So one of my children had a more of a difficult temperament than my other. So speaking of different temperaments, so Chess and Thomas classified easy child, generally positive, quickly establishes regular routines, adapts easily to new experiences. Difficult child reacts negatively and cries frequently, engages in irregular daily routines, slow to accept change, and slow to warm up. Child is low activity level, somewhat negative, displays low intensity of mood. So based on this personality, based on your own personality, and maybe even some stories you've heard of when you were a child, where do you think you would be on the spectrum? So when I consider my children, I would definitely say that my youngest one was a very easy child. He was typically positive. He, had pretty regular routine, and he adapted really well. And even to this day, he's a very laid back kid. He does have instances where if something upsets him, he's upset for a while. But I'd say for the most part, he's very laid back. My other son, he actually, I would put him not really, I guess not slow to warm up. He was pretty positive. He liked to laugh and stuff. And he was able to establish regular routines, typically pretty quickly. And he was fun, and he liked adapting to new experiences and things. But he was very dramatic, and sometimes would cry frequently. Sometimes he'd react negatively. So I would say he's a lot more difficult to put in in one of these categories because his intensity was very high for his mood. Like he was, but it varied. In one second, he was very positive, but when it would become negative, he would react negatively, but it would be more intense. So I would say my oldest child does not really fit into these categories, and to think about the way I was as a child. I was told that I sat quietly and stared a lot at people. So that's most of what I know. I haven't been told a lot, but I didn't. I might be slow to warm up because um, I didn't really cry intensely that I was told. So I might fit more into this category, I guess. So where would you guys be? Now, these are things I want you to look at from your book. In your book, I don't want to go into great detail about these, but um, these things impact a child's overall, emotional, social emotional development in infancy. So, development of temperament, such as effortful control, self-regulation. Self-regulation is very important, and inhibition to the unfamiliar shows shyness with strangers. So you can learn more about this in your book. Biological foundations and experience. So there's physiological influences, gender and cultural influences. So a parent may react differently to a child's temperament depending on gender. So parents in our culture may react differently to their little infant girl cries versus boy cries. So, because they may not think boys should cry, right? Um, so that's something to think about. So, cultural differences in temperament were linked to parental attitude and behaviors. Um, that's so consider that in different cultures, different things are allowed. So, and these different or the differences in temperament between our culture and other cultures were linked to basically our culture, how our the attitude of the parents, goodness of fit. So the match between the child's temperament and the environmental demands the child must cope with. So the lack of fit could cause adjustment problems. So think about that. So let's say a child that might cry often and a parent who doesn't think a child should be crying ever, right? There used to be a saying that children should be seen and not heard, right? So those types of parents may react angrily to a child who is crying a lot. And it may be much more difficult to adjust a child that has more of a difficult temperament and cries to a family who believes that crying for these infants is wrong. Um, so that might cause animosity between the parent and the child, may cause the attachment problems. So Erickson's trust versus mistrust stage. So that, like I mentioned earlier, so a crying infant, the child cries, you go pick up and comfort the child. This creates trust, helping, attending to their needs versus ignoring them and this child getting this, I don't know if this person's going to be there for me idea. Developing a sense of self, so self-recognition, self-awareness, emerging sense of me, and independence. Erickson's autonomy versus shame and doubt stage. So I want to do these things by myself um, versus I can't do these things by myself. But I want to do these things by myself, so I'm going to go try to do them. And that's when the children start to become independent. They don't want people to help them. They think that they can climb this set of stairs without anybody helping them. When the parent is just freaked out and it's like, oh my gosh, I know you're going to fall down the stairs. Because as a parent, you want to protect your children, right? So seeing them want to climb these stairs, which children typically do that. So if you have an infant, you'll see a lot of people with baby gates on their stairs because these infants are wanting to climb these stairs. So this is kind of like the infant, like, I want to do things on my own. And that's beneficial to the infant growing up and learning. And this is how they learn, by doing things. But it's also really scary as a parent when you see your kid wanting to do something that you know they don't have the capacity to physically do at that time. Well, here is a nice video about the emerging sense of self. So I thought this was interesting, and it kind of, it's the Rouge test. It talked about something that your book mentioned.
Who's that in the mirror?
This is known as a mirror self-recognition test, which may offer clues about the development of self-awareness. Without alerting the child, a mark is placed on its forehead.
Where's the baby? Where's the baby?
Usually, a baby younger than about 18 months doesn't make the connection between itself and the person in the mirror. The child may even look behind the mirror for the stranger it sees.
Hi. Hi. Dad.
But by about 18 months, there's a change in the child's awareness. Now it notices the red dot and the link between itself and the image in the mirror.
It's not ready.
What's not red?
My this. My head.
Over the next few years, children go on to fulfill their human birthright, constructing an increasingly sophisticated sense of self. They will have a rich and complex life of the mind, and a sense of being the central characters in their own dramas.
So as you saw, at a certain age, kids do not have any idea. When they look at the mirror, they think it's another child. You saw that one that was saying, hi, hi, and looked behind the mirror for this kid. He was like, where is this kid? And they did not realize that that was them, right? But at a certain point, they do. They look in the mirror and, oh, that's me. I'm the person that I'm staring at right now. All right, this is the last slide for this section. The next section we'll be talking about is social orientation and attachment.